Welcome to The Pie from the Becker Friedman Institute for Economics at the University of Chicago. I'm Tess Vigland. We are a mobile population in this country. We move around a lot and often long distances. The most recent figures from the Census Bureau showed 8.2 million people moved between states in 2022. Widen that out to moving not just between states, but within, and the number of people relocating jumps to 40 million. That's a lot of pickup trucks, U-Hauls, and semis full of stuff. One reason for all this moving around is people relocating for jobs. And sometimes that means tough decisions for spouses whose career is going to advance because of a move. Today, we're going to hear about some research into that trade-off. And our guest is probably familiar because he's been on the show several times. Matt Notowidigdo is the David McDaniel Keller Professor of Economics at Chicago's Booth School of Business. Welcome back to The Pie.
Thanks for having me. Good to be here.
And as a reminder, listeners, you can now view this show. We're on YouTube, so head on over there and search for Becker Friedman Institute. Okay, Matt, have you ever made a move for a job or maybe gone with a partner who did so?
Yeah, well, we moved to Chicago after I graduated with my PhD in economics from MIT. We had been living there for about 6 years, and we picked up and moved to Chicago so I could become a professor here at the University of Chicago. And we've been here ever since.
Yeah, I did the same. In fact, I did a move across the country from Boston to Los Angeles back in 2001, and it was actually for my career, and my then husband was totally cool with it, which I thought was incredibly progressive back then. So today we're going to talk about some of the trade-offs that come with those decisions. And of course, as we both know, when you do this sort of move for one spouse or partner, it can have an impact on the other's career. And one impact can be earnings potential. So you decided to look into that and are taking us not to the heart of America, but to Sweden and Germany.
That's correct. Yeah, we actually started wanting to work on this project in the United States, but the problem is it's very difficult to get the right kind of data. The publicly available survey data in the United States doesn't follow people over a long enough period of time to see what happens to you, after you move across areas. And so we basically built a team of co-authors that allowed us to study the effects of relocating using really high quality data in Germany and in Sweden. One of the reasons we were excited to do that is that Germany and Sweden are different countries in many ways. They have very different labor market institutions, and they're also thought to have pretty different gender norms. So I think it's nice to have both of them in the paper. So we kind of study them side by side and present them side by side.
And as you kind of just alluded to, you really were looking at differences between men and women. This is really just heterosexual couples, right?
That's right. That's right. Yeah. And we did that from the very beginning, in part because we wanted to study what is the impact of an opposite sex couple that relocates, who benefits more in terms of experiencing faster earnings growth after they move versus before. Does it disproportionately benefit the man, or do the man and the woman benefit equally after they move?
You would think that earnings or income would be a primary motivator for anyone to move from one job to another, right? A boost in household income. Is that generally true regardless of which or whose career you're moving for?
Well, people move for lots of reasons. I learned this back in graduate school. If you survey people, moving for a job is one of the main reasons why people move, but that's not the only reason. So
Sure.
some people move to be closer to family. Some people move because they just want nicer weather. But moving for a job is one of the main reasons why people relocate. And, really the starting point of this project is just a fundamental trade-off between, if you're going to relocate, you might end up relocating in a way that prioritizes one spouse's career or the other. And we wanted to see if there was a gender lens to understand that in these two countries that we were looking at.
All right. So, as you just said, you wanted to look at the difference in impact between when a decision to move is for a woman's job or a man's job in the relationship. What were you measuring and how did you measure it in these two countries?
Yeah, so our data you can think of as being kind of like the equivalent of IRS tax returns de-identified. So we're not looking at any individual's income. So de-identified tax records from both countries. And what we focused first on was just overall earnings. So how much income do you earn from work? And we measured that for both the man and the woman in these opposite sex couples. And we measured how that changed after they chose to relocate. And in both countries, what we found was that the income tended to go up a lot more for the man as compared to the woman after the move, which could be consistent with these couples prioritizing the man's career when they decided whether or not to relocate.
That's kind of depressing to me as a woman. Can you walk us through that and where that
Yeah.
gap happens?
Sure. And I should maybe I should have said as a quick background, I am a co-author on this paper with 5 other co-authors. Some of them are based in Germany, some of them are based in Sweden. That's partly how we were able to get access to this data. And I also have 2 other co-authors based in the United States. All 5 of the other co-authors are women, so
Ah.
they describe me as the token male on the team. And
I love that.
but all of us were interested in studying this. We were really, I think, all motivated by different anecdotes we had had in our own lives of either friends or coworkers or people we were trying to recruit, where some of the challenges that we were hearing were that, well, we'd like to move, but not clear that my spouse could find a job there. And we just seemed to be observing more often than not that, well, when someone had to make a sacrifice to be able to make that decision to take advantage of this new opportunity, it was more often than not the woman in the couple that was making that sacrifice. And so I mean, we're economists, so we want to look at data, but we were motivated by these stories to see if those stories were kind of representative of a larger phenomenon. But the other thing I wanted to say is that there's some very old work in economics going back decades by economists, like basically the founding fathers of the Chicago School of Economics, that were also interested in family migration decisions. And they made a point that I think is useful to start with, which is that if men earn more than women on average, then it's probably more likely that the man is going to experience an increase in earnings that justifies making the move, because moving is costly. I mean, it's costly in financial terms, but it's also costly in terms of the time costs, logistical costs, and then also there's, I would say, like the psychological cost of just, leaving your friends and family behind, perhaps.
Mm,
And so
mhm.
to be able to get over that hurdle, you might need a certain amount of money for the household, and it might just be more likely that the man is going to experience an increase in earnings to justify all of those costs. And that's the case if, in fact, men are earning more than women on average, which is true in the US as well as true in Germany and Sweden. Now, none of this has anything to do with like gender norms or prioritizing the man's career for reasons other than just the fact that we're going to make moving decisions in a way that maximizes the total amount of income for the household. And so I think the starting point for our paper, like intellectually, was trying to distinguish between, are these households moving for the man's career because the man is earning more? Or are they moving for the man's career simply because they prioritize the man's career, whether or not the man is earning more? And that's like a well-defined research question that we thought we could make progress on with our data.
But then what if they're moving for the woman's job? Because you would assume that maybe this is not an assumption I should make, but that if you're moving for the woman's job or or the man, that she's probably going to be making more money,
Well, I
right?
think that's along the lines of how we kind of wanted to try to make progress here, was that suppose you could find couples where the man and the woman have similar skills, similar backgrounds, similar earnings
Mm,
potential. Then in those subset of couples, in these couples where the man and the woman have similar earnings potential, similar potential for earnings growth, then like statistically speaking, those couples should be just as likely to move for the man as to move for the woman. And that was kind of the insight that led us to kind of collect all this data and not look at all couples overall, but do that first and then zoom in, so to speak, on the subset of couples where the man and the woman have similar earnings potential. Or imagine the case where the woman is earning more, then it should be more likely that you're moving for the woman's career if she's the one that has more earnings opportunities going forward. And I have to share a quick story. One of these Chicago School of Economics founding fathers was Jacob Mincer, and I just discovered an interview that he gave many years ago where it turned out he actually moved for his wife's career because she was a medical resident.
oh my goodness.
And she was getting paid a lot more than an academic economist. And so they actually moved to New York, and he ended up working at Columbia University in part because he was moving for her career. And
Hmm.
so I think it's interesting to note that, because I think he was thinking about these issues many decades ago, and in kind of the same way we were thinking today. It's just the only difference is that we wanted to try to think separately about the role of these gender norms alongside these standard considerations about just, well, who's earning more and whose career should we follow. That's kind of where we started with our project.
Hmm. That's so interesting. So, talk to us about this gap then. What is the gap? How big is it? How long does it persist? Does it even out over time? And then I want to hear if kind of there are any differences between Sweden and Germany.
Sure. So in both countries, what we find is that after the couples choose to relocate, the man's income goes up by more than the women's. And in both countries, the woman's income doesn't go up by very much at all, whereas the man's income goes up by about 10 to 15% in both countries. And though that increase is persistent. So what that means is that there's basically a gender gap between the man's income and the woman's income that grows after the move and remains after the move. So it doesn't kind of go away, it stays there persistently for many, many years after the move. We follow these couples because our data is so rich and detailed. We can follow the couples 5 to 10 years after they've relocated. And
Hmm.
it's still the case that the man is earning more and the man has experienced more earnings growth after the move as compared to the woman. Now, that's true in both Germany and Sweden. But we do see bigger impacts in Germany as compared to Sweden. So the kind
Hmm.
of fanning out of income that I'm describing is larger in Germany as compared to Sweden. And that was what we had expected when we started the project, because there's a lot of work in various subfields in economics suggesting that the egalitarian gender norms, if you want to call them that, are a bit stronger in Sweden as compared to Germany. And so maybe you would
Uh,
have expected to see less of an impact in Sweden as compared to Germany. But you still see these gender gaps emerging in Sweden as well.
what about age? How does that impact all of this?
So we looked at that, and the effects look pretty well, they emerge across all age groups, but they're larger among younger workers. That was also in line with our expectations because people are more likely to move earlier in their career, and they also experience more earnings growth earlier in their career. And so it wasn't that surprising to us that you saw bigger impacts for younger workers, but you also see bigger gender gaps fanning out for the younger workers as well. Another interesting dimension of heterogeneity that we looked at was whether or not the couples had children, because when we
Mm-hmm.
presented this research, many people wondered whether this is related to the fact that the couples could be having recently had a child, or maybe they're planning to have a child. And somewhat to our surprise, all of our main results were very similar when we compared couples with children to without children. We looked at couples that never had any children during the sample period. And so there was a lot of interesting work in economics about the labor market impacts of having children. And what we wanted to kind of communicate, what we think we've learned from our results, is that these earnings effects of relocating are almost orthogonal. Like they're also happening, but they're happening alongside the effects of children, and they don't seem primarily related to whether or not you have children. So
Huh.
it's really a distinct phenomenon in a way that we were a bit surprised by. We thought that they would very much be related by the fact that, well, maybe these are happening around the same time you're having a child, and that just isn't true in either country.
Well, they say that the most stressful things you can do in life are what? Get married, have a kid, and move. So maybe you don't want to do two of those at the same time, right?
That sounds right. You want to give some space between each of them. But no, but what we see in both countries is that people are just as likely to have their children before or after these large relocation decisions. And
Hmm.
for me, what's most striking is just that our results are very similar, even in the subset of couples that don't have any children at all. So for those
That
couples, it's not about kind of the so-called female child penalty. It's really that those couples without children are still making decisions when they relocate that looks to be prioritizing the man's career.
All right. And you also looked at the reason for moving. I've mostly been talking about this as a decision that's made by couples, but sometimes that decision is made for you by a pink slip. And you looked at some mass layoffs and their impact on decisions to move as well.
Yeah, so the reason we did that is that um, these results I've been talking about so far are based on couples that choose to move, and
Right.
we don't really know why they're choosing to move. They could be choosing for reasons that are related to the job. They could be moving for other reasons. Therefore, we wanted to complement the results with a kind of different research strategy. And so there we looked at people who are getting laid off. There's decades of work in labor economics about what happens when people lose their job through what we call mass layoff events. Mass layoff events are just you're at a company, an establishment, a firm that lays off a large share of their workforce. Decades ago, this would be like manufacturing plants closing down, for example. But today, it's
Sure.
just any major downsizing. Now, why are we doing that? The reason we do that is because we want to make sure we're looking at people getting laid off, likely for no reason of their own. It's just something about the business's conditions that led them to lay off a large share of their workforce. And now all of these individuals have to figure out what to do. And one of the things they choose to do is they choose to relocate because now they've been fired and they can find better labor market opportunities somewhere else. And so what we found in our analysis, though, was that we looked at situations where the man in the couple gets laid off through one of these mass layoff events. And then we looked at couples where the woman gets laid off through one of these same mass layoff events. And what we found was that the couples in both countries were much more likely to relocate when the man gets laid off as compared to when the woman gets laid off. And again, there are economic explanations for this. Perhaps the women are working in occupations where it doesn't benefit them a lot to move somewhere else. So we tried to look at different explanations based on differences in occupation or education. We didn't find a lot of reasons to think that that was the main reason that's going on. It really does look like it's about the gender of who gets laid off. And when the man gets laid off, the couple seems much more willing to pull the trigger and go somewhere else. And so we sort of view that as an additional piece of evidence that the couples are behaving as if they're prioritizing the man's career, almost as if they're putting more weight on the dollars that get earned by the man as compared to the woman.
So this brings us to what I thought was such an interesting branch of this research. When you are looking at those gender norms, basically cultural norms, right? And you looked at this earnings gap through the lens of gender norms, specifically in Germany. So we're setting Sweden aside for now. And you examine the differences in whether people hailed from East or West Germany. Take us through these findings.
Yeah, this was all very new to me, which is a sign that I'm, more an economist than a historian. But what my
Or
co-authors,
sociologist.
yeah, what they told me and taught me was that the legacy of basically socialism in East Germany. So think about Germany prior to the fall of the German Wall, where Germany was split into East Germany and West Germany. Is that the legacy of socialism in East Germany was such that they instilled egalitarian gender norms through a lot of different ways. One is they had a lot of public funding for childcare. There was a lot of almost like government propaganda, I think it would be fair to say, to encourage women to work and remain in the labor force. And West Germany, by contrast, was very much in the opposite direction. West Germany had tax system that kind of in ways looks like part of the tax system today in the United States, where if you have a secondary earner, they end up facing very high tax rates. It's not easy to find childcare for your children outside of the school day. The kids just don't go to school for very long when they're young. And so it's very difficult for women in West Germany to have remained in the labor force, whereas women in East Germany ended up with very high labor force participation rates, among the highest in Europe. So this has been going on for decades. And then you have the fall of the German Wall, and then you have all of this economic integration, people moving around. And so what we were able to do is we were able to look at couples working in West Germany, but some of them were from East Germany and working in West Germany, and some of them were raised in West Germany. And what we found was that for the couples where one or both of the members of the couple was raised in East Germany, those couples had very small gender gaps in their earnings growth after they relocated. So both men's income and women's income went up by about the same amount. Or another way of saying that is that they were just as likely to move for the man's career as the woman's career if they were of East German origin compared to West German origin. And I found this all very fascinating. It's hard to put into an economic model, but it's also pretty easy to interpret in light of this historical legacy that these two parts of Germany have essentially evolved very different gender norms. And it's just interesting to see how strongly that's correlated with the effects of these couples when they choose to relocate, whether they're prioritizing the man or the woman's career.
I'd be curious then if you see, again, based on an age bracket, if that makes a difference, because you're certainly in the labor force going to have people who were born who did not grow up in any sort of East German. Of course, their parents might have, but you have younger people who did not have that differentiator at all.
That's a great idea. Actually, we haven't done that, but it's something we could do.
There's your next research.
Yeah, there you go. I would say what we have seen in the literature is that the children of the parents that grew up in former East Germany, those children do end up with more progressive gender norms in the sense they're much more likely to marry women that are working. They're much more likely to have their female spouse continue to work. These are the boys of the parents who grew up in East Germany. So
Yeah.
your idea, I think, is interesting because I think based on this research, you'd expect some persistence, even though they didn't grow up in those areas, as you point out.
They've had the model
They've
their
had
whole
the model
lives.
for them.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay, so obviously we are not in Germany or Sweden. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how you might relate this to our experience here in the US.
Sure. I think well, let me do it by talking about the last, it's kind of the last piece of our paper, which is so there's an economic model that we write down and try to use that to interpret the results. And one of the things we use the model for is to understand what I alluded to before, the so-called female child penalty. So
Mhm.
this is the change in earnings for women after the birth of their first child. Okay, and so there's a whole cottage industry in economics right now estimating these so-called child penalties in countries all over the
Yeah,
world.
or the mommy penalty, more
Yes,
more
yes.
to the point.
That's a more accurate way of saying it. I agree with you. I mean, the
Yeah,
terminology is a bit loaded, in my opinion, because calling it a penalty is it's a bit normative. But the
sure.
point is, after the birth of the first child, women's earnings go down more than men in virtually every country all over the world. But the actual gender gaps varies by quite a bit. So in Sweden, women's income goes down, but it only goes down by about 20% compared to men. In Germany and Denmark. I'm sorry, in Sweden and Denmark, it goes down by about 20%. In countries like Germany, it goes down by more like 50 to 60%. So it's just
Wow.
a much bigger reduction in women's income. Now, US is somewhere in between, about 30 to 40%. And US is kind of like the UK. So if you want to stereotypically group different countries together, the Scandinavian countries, for the most part, the women's earnings don't go down by nearly as much after the birth of their first child. And countries like Germany and Austria and Switzerland, there's big declines. And the US and UK and Canada are somewhere in between. Okay, so these are some existing findings that are already out there. And what I think is interesting, if you think about our paper, which is about Germany and Sweden, alongside those child penalty papers, is we found bigger impacts in terms of bigger gender gaps after the move in Germany as compared to Sweden. And I think it's probably not a coincidence that Sweden has these smaller gender gaps in earnings after the couples relocate, and Sweden also has smaller gender gaps when women give birth to the child. Now, these are different decisions. One is the birth of your first child, one is deciding whether or not to relocate, but they might be all connected to the same underlying gender norm, which is the extent to which you prioritize the man's career more than the women's. And the way that we quantify that is we think about the household behaving as if they put less weight on income earned by the woman compared to the man. It's like I discount the woman's earnings. And interestingly, Jacob Minzer, the Chicago economist I talked about, a while ago, decades ago, he has this obscure footnote that he calls this a type of male chauvinism, that the men can't be bothered to interpret, they can't be bothered to think of the woman's income as worth as much as their income. But that's really
I'm
what we're
sure
trying to
that never
operationalize.
happens today.
So, okay, so the way I'm trying to relate this to the United States is that what I think one of the things we're learning from our paper is that you're going to see bigger child penalties in the same countries where you're going to expect bigger gender gaps when these couples choose to relocate. These things just go hand in hand.
Mhm.
And so if that's true, then we can actually make a prediction about what our results would look like if we were able to get data from the United States. Is again, because as I said, the United States, the child penalty is kind of in between Sweden and Germany. And so then I would conjecture that the earnings effects of relocating are going to kind of also be in between. So you'd still expect there to be a gender gap, and it's going to grow, that when couples choose to relocate in the United States, they're also going to do it in a way that's going to disproportionately benefit the man's career, but probably not by as much as in Germany, but probably more than in Sweden. So I think
Hmm.
it's a neat way of, I think, extrapolating, but not in a way that's arbitrary, from our results in Germany and Sweden into the results that you might expect to see in the United States. And hopefully someone gets data and proves me right or proves me wrong.
Do you think couples imagine that they're making these decisions based on parity and maybe are unaware that gender norms are, coming in there maybe kind of sneakily?
I love that question. So we are doing a follow-up project, and it's going to be in the US in the sense that we're recruiting couples on Qualtrics and Prolific. These are survey platforms where we're going to be able to recruit couples, and we're going to ask them hypothetical questions to get at what you're asking. And the reason why these hypothetical questions might be useful is we'll be able to see the extent to which they're really thinking about it, or maybe it's just something that's happening, less consciously. And what I mean by that is, um, I'm doing a lot more work in behavioral economics these days. And one of the ideas in behavioral economics that behavior economists have been really interested in. Actually, my colleague Dick Thaler won the Nobel Memorial Prize for this, is just
Sure.
understanding whether people really treat a dollar like a dollar. Do I treat a dollar in my retirement account the same way as I treat a dollar from income? I know a dollar is a dollar, so all of our standard economic models is that you should respect what's called the fungibility of money. A dollar is worth a dollar, whether that dollar is in place A or place B, or savings account A or retirement account B. Now, and
But
there's
people do not
people
follow
do not.
norms.
Right. Thank you for emphasizing that. This is why he has the Nobel Memorial Prize, right? So people
Yep.
do not respect the fungibility of money. They treat different pots of money differently. They treat different types of dollars differently. And so, it's a bit of a stretch, but I think when I've been working on this paper, one of the ways that I've thought about it is that these households are behaving as if they don't treat the man's money and the woman's money as the same, which, at some level is highly irrational because money is money. And it's possible that the couples are treating the man's income as being worth more in a way that they're not even that aware of. And then that's a different type of gender norm, because it's not really about, well, to use Mintzer's phrase, it's not really about male chauvinism as much as we might just be making a kind of probabilistic error that maybe, because the man's earning more, we should always be prioritizing the man's job. And, that doesn't always make sense, because if the woman gets a big raise, then you want to think about that dollar value change the same way that I would treat the same dollar change for the man. And so our hypothetical surveys that we're working on is our way of trying to get at that. So, if I had to guess, the truth is there probably is a genuine mix of just a strong gender norm to prioritize the man's career. But I also just think, drawing on these lessons from behavioral economics, there could be this kind of almost financial illiteracy of not realizing that it's all the same money. And so you want to respond the same way for the same change in dollars, whether the man is getting the raise or the woman's getting the raise. And so, yeah, we'll see what happens. Hopefully in a year or so, we'll have some results to share with you then.
It makes me wish that we had information on that across the span of time, right? So that you could see whether this idea of parity in women's careers, men's careers, even though, of course, the paycheck problem is still there. Like, has that really gotten better? And will it potentially get better again over time into the future?
Yeah, we tried to look into this a little bit because, our data is so rich and detailed. We actually could look a little bit at the extent to which these gender norms might have been changing over time. A very common hypothesis I got when I presented this work to academic audiences is like, oh, this is really interesting, but maybe those gender norms were stronger at the beginning of the sample period and weaker towards the end.
Yeah.
We didn't find that much evidence for that. And,
Huh.
another way of seeing that is that, and this is one of the recent changes or additions we've made to the paper, is that we collected a bunch of additional detailed data on just single people moving around. And when single people move in Sweden, the men and the women, when they choose to move on their own without having to sell a spouse on the idea, their average increase in income is very similar. And I think that's pretty striking, because it suggests that it's not that women don't like moving or that they don't benefit as much from moving. It's just that when they have to convince their husband to move, they end up being less likely to be able to get the same earnings increases. And, I think somewhat pessimistically, that still seems true even in our most recent years of data in Sweden. And again, I just to reiterate, Sweden is thought to be a country with very progressive gender norms.
Absolutely.
And yet it's still the case that they seem to be moving in a way that's prioritizing the man's career. And maybe what's especially surprising about that is that actually in Sweden, women are more educated on average. Plenty of them have high earnings potential. And yet you still don't see many instances where it looks as if they're moving primarily to support the woman's career.
Wow. Okay, well, I can't wait to talk to you in 10 years when we watch this over time again. Or maybe after you do the survey here in the US, that would be great.
Sounds
All
great.
right, are you ready for a lightning round?
Sure.
Okay. What book or books are you reading, or would you recommend?
Well, I'm reading some of the Hunger Games books along with my oldest daughter.
Oh, fun.
So that's pretty fun. I don't usually read fiction, I have to say. I'm kind of a boring academic. I've also gone back and read a lot of, this is going to sound really nerdy, but I've read a lot of old Supreme Court opinions recently, with all the flurry of executive orders. I think one of the ones that caught my attention was when President Trump said he was going to criminalize flag burning. I went back and read the original Texas versus Johnson Supreme Court opinion on the constitutionality of flag burning. And it's just really fascinating to read about how the Supreme Court, many years ago thought about these issues that are still relevant today.
Do you have a legal background at all, or this
I
is just
don't.
interesting to
It's
you?
like
Huh.
in an alternative life, maybe I would have gone to law school, but no, I went the academic economics route instead.
Well, speaking of that, what class influenced you when you were a student?
Oh, that's fun one. I think the class that convinced me to be an economist was actually my intermediate undergraduate microeconomics class taught by David Otter. He's a professor at MIT.
Hmm.
And, what I loved about it was just all the different topics. We had, just as an example, there was out of wedlock childbearing. There was the economics of abortion policy. There was a lot of work at the intersection of the labor market and crime. It felt like there were all these exciting topics that economists, if they got the right data and could think about the right frameworks, would be able
Hmm.
to study something. It was sort of, years before Freakonomics. It made economics seem really exciting.
And finally, Matt, if you had to make a pie with the current contents of your kitchen, what would it be?
I think I said apple pie last time, but I think
Uh-huh.
I have
You
to
still
say
have
that again,
apples?
because we just went apple picking. It's such a great time of year to do it in Chicago. Well, we don't do it in Chicago. We drive across the border to Indiana and we go pick
Ah,
a bunch of apples at these large apple orchards. And so I think it would have to be apple pie again.
well, that sounds delicious. I lived in New England for several years, and around this time, we would drive up to Vermont and pick apples. And my favorite part, though, was that they always had apple cider donuts at the farms where we went for apples.
We
I don't know if
the
they have that in
same. No,
Indiana
we
too.
have the apple cider donuts, and apple cider is really the price of admission to get the children to come along and do the activity.
That is a fair
But then we
price.
get too many apples, and so then that's why the apple pie makes sense.
Uh,
Yeah,
Sounds delicious. Well, Matt Notowidigdo, thanks so much for coming back and chatting with us.
thanks for having me.